Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American culture in the 1980s. In our previous lecture, we talked about the Reagan presidency and the prominence of the Cold War in popular culture, particularly in the realm of sports. In this lecture, we'll continue our discussion of the Cold War and its prominence in the 1980s, focusing on the realm of film. The Cold War and fears over nuclear power and weapons played out in many aspects of American culture. Uncertainties about nuclear power drew increasing scrutiny in 1979 when the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant near Middletown, Pennsylvania, suffered a partial meltdown. The accident, which ultimately was contained and didn't result in any human injuries, sparked national panic about the safety of such power plants. The panic was accentuated by the film The China Syndrome, starring Michael Douglas and Jane Fonda, by coincidence released only 2 weeks before the 3 Mile Island incident. While these fears subsided somewhat over time, the Chernobyl accident in the Soviet Union in April 1986 proved far worse than any accidents in the United States. In that incident, massive explosions at the Chernobyl nuclear plant sparked fires and released massive amounts of nuclear material into the air. The incident led directly to more than 24 deaths, hundreds more suffering radiation poisoning and dying months later, and the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people from the surrounding area, which remains a nuclear wasteland even now. While the event happened halfway around the world, it underscored for Americans the hazards of nuclear power. Concerns over nuclear power, coupled with nuclear weapons and the possibility of World War III, to create an atmosphere of fear that permeated popular culture through much of the 1980s. Such concerns are perhaps most evident in the movies of that era. Fears about the proliferation of nuclear weapons are well represented in the 1983 movie War Games. On the one hand, the film spoke to the dawning of the personal computer age, as teen acting star Matthew Broderick plays a troubled student with computer hacking skills. Broderick inadvertently breaks into the United States national security system, and thinking he's playing a game, sets in motion a nuclear exercise that will ultimately launch the nuclear missiles and spark World War III. In a riveting final sequence, the computer engages in a series of simulations of nuclear war, each of them ending in the destruction of the world. Nuclear war is futile. The moral of the story was clear. Less optimistic was 1984's Red Dawn, which also starred an all-star cast of budding teen stars. In that movie, a combination of Cuban and Russian forces invaded North America, and World War III was on. Rather than a nuclear holocaust, Red Dawn depicted a post-war Holocaust in which Americans were defeated and humiliated. Only a small pocket of resistance remained, a group of teen guerrilla fighters calling themselves the Wolverines. While the teens do manage to notch some significant victories against the invading troops, eventually their numbers dwindle, as several of them are killed. In the final sequence, the handful of survivors head out over barren territory in search of other survivors. It was hardly an uplifting message. By the mid-1980s, America also seemed ready to wrestle with the legacy of Vietnam, as a series of Vietnam-related films hit the big screen, often to rave reviews and awards. There were 3 popular Vietnam movies released in 1987. Oliver Stone's Platoon won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Stanley Kubrick made his long-awaited return to filmmaking with Full Metal Jacket. And Good Morning Vietnam opened late in the year to rave reviews. Robin Williams, known to that point as a wild comedian for such roles as the alien Mork in the popular television show Mork and Mindy, made a dramatic turn in Good Morning Vietnam. He played irreverent wartime DJ Adrian Cronauer. The role allowed Williams to perform many comic riffs, But the storyline grew grim as Cronauer's superior officers found his comedy offensive and set about to undermine his career, even sending him into the combat zone at the risk of death. While more lighthearted than Platoon or Full Metal Jacket, Good Morning Vietnam still underscored that the Vietnam War had been misguided and surreal, and that many terrible injustices had been done. Born on the 4th of July in 1989 added another Vietnam film. In that film, Tom Cruise played disabled veteran Ron Kovic. Based on Kovic's autobiography, and thus depicting a true story, Born on the 4th of July underscored the awful conditions that American soldiers were subjected to in Vietnam, and the physical and emotional scars they carried as Vietnam veterans. Collectively, these and other films of the 80s drove home the message that America's experience in Vietnam had been horrific. Another series of films seemed to celebrate physical brawn and military-style violence. Headlining these movies were a group of Hollywood heroes, including Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Chuck Norris, among others. Most of their films feature lone men, noble but ostracized from society for one reason or another, compelled to wage vigilante warfare against the forces of evil, whoever they are. Perhaps the best example of such films are the Rambo series, starring Stallone. In the first film, called First Blood, Stallone plays John Rambo, a displaced Vietnam veteran wandering the roadsides on his way to visit an old friend. Finding himself in Hope, Washington, he is harassed by the local police chief for his long hair and unkempt appearance. The chief escalates the issue, ultimately leading Rambo to wage full-on war against his attackers. Rambo uses his military expertise to elude the police and to disable them without killing them, but the chief will not be appeased. The film ends with Rambo victorious, but taken into police custody and breaking down over the abuse he and his fellow soldiers suffered in Vietnam. The film was a box office success, making more than $125 million, and actually was the first American film to be released in China in 1985. It's clear that the wicked police chief is the villain in the film, and the Vietnam veteran Rambo is the hero. That said, it also brought violence, and particularly gun violence, to new prominence, and set off a string of sequels that grew even more violent. The succeeding Rambo films, Rambo 2 in 1985 and Rambo 3 in 1988, featured guns, violence, and explosions even more prominently than the first movie. They also came in an era when such films were becoming far more common Hollywood productions, including Commando, Predator, and the Die Hard series. One scholar has appropriately nicknamed such films popcorn patriotism, noting that the films usually involve an American soldier engaged in some flag-waving mission to uphold American honor. This was cinema in Reagan-era America. No butt-kicking, flag-waving military movie was better than 1986's Top Gun, featuring a high-flying cast of young superstars, including Val Kilmer, Anthony Edwards, and Tom Cruise, starring as Maverick. Top Gun introduced an element of realism to the flight and action sequences that no other film to that point could match. In the film, American fighter pilots have to fend off relentless and soulless Soviet pilots intent on shooting them down, utilizing smarts and moxie to pilot their bigger, slower, but more powerful planes. While not overtly anti-Soviet, Top Gun was clearly pro-American and fits squarely in the tradition of popcorn patriotism. It also featured a soundtrack that won many awards. It became one of the biggest moneymakers of the decade, grossing $356 million at the box office. A long-awaited sequel is scheduled for release in the summer of 2021. Stallone's other mega franchise, the Rocky series, also got in on the Cold War action with 1985's Rocky IV. This film may be the best or the worst of the Rocky movies, depending who you ask. In the film, Rocky Balboa, the aging champion, is compelled to meet the vicious and seemingly invincible Soviet champion, Ivan Drago. The movie is packed with flashbacks and high-energy training sequences, making for easily panned fare for the critics. It's also dripping with pro-American propaganda, including a cheesy pre-fight musical number featuring American icon James Brown singing Living in America. At the same time, though, the film attempted to incorporate a positive message in the end, as Rocky defeats Drago before a Soviet crowd so won over by Rocky's heart that they wind up cheering for him in the end. "If I can change, we all can change," says Rocky in the end, calling for cooperation between the two sides. Cold War themes featured prominently in films right up to the end of the Cold War itself, and beyond. One of the top films of 1990 was The Hunt for Red October, based on a 1984 novel by Tom Clancy. The film starred a young Alec Baldwin as Jack Ryan, a CIA interpreter with an expertise in Soviet military activity, and Sean Connery as Marco Ramius, a senior Soviet submarine captain at the helm of a new, ultra-quiet nuclear sub. Through a brilliantly conceived plot, it becomes clear that Ramius is attempting to defect, not to launch a surprise attack against the United States as initially feared. The message, once again, is one of understanding and compromise across the Iron Curtain. Although it's clear that the American system is best and the Soviet system is archaic and primitive. After all, how many films feature storylines of Americans defecting to Russia? While television tended to stay away from the deeper concerns of the Cold War, at times the Cold War played out on television as well. Notably, in October 1983, ABC aired the television movie The Day After. The film was set in Kansas after nuclear war has wiped out most of humanity. It was terrifying, and some scholars argue that it ultimately helped to contribute to the end of the Cold War itself. President Ronald Reagan wrote about it in his diary. "I ran the tape of the movie ABC is running on the air on November 20th, Reagan wrote on October 10th, 1983. It's called The Day After. It has Lawrence, Kansas wiped out in a nuclear war with Russia. It is powerfully done, all $7 million worth. Those scholars argue that the film was so horrifying it encouraged Reagan to avoid nuclear war and de-escalate nuclear tensions in the later years of his presidency, although that process did follow years of a nuclear arms race. In our next lecture, we'll talk about efforts to ease the Cold War tensions of the 80s, in part through the stirring music of that decade.